Hey there, Scott Martin from Bonsai Matsu, and this is the Bonsai Stuff podcast. The podcast about everything bonsai. Everything, absolutely everything. But at the moment, the important time of the year is this repotting cycle. And as I threatened for a while ago, there's going to be a few episodes of the podcast on repotting because it's highly topical. And the one I want to talk about today is probably one of the most important ones. It's when you decide not to repot one of your bonsai. And I'm doing it now because it's probably about now that you've decided, I think I'm okay. You're getting close. Well, I'm in the last couple of weeks thereabouts of my repotting cycle. So you might have a little bit more ahead of you, a little bit less, whatever, depending. But you're probably at a point where you've started repotting, you've made your decision, you've flagged trees for repotting, and you've looked at some and gone, they'll be right. Another year won't hurt. I'll just leave them for a little bit longer. You still have time. That's why I wanted to put the podcast out at this point in the repotting cycle, because you've still got time to make the decision to go, you know what, I am going to repot it. Because I thought I'd just talk about what the downside of not repotting is. Upside of not repotting is finer, delicate growth, right? When it works, when it does work, it's on old maples, on old deciduous, on anything. It's nice. You know, the repotting process is that reinvigoration that allows for the tree to really kick off and get going, and the growth can be a bit coarse, a bit long, a bit too much strength in it, can be too thick and a bit of a setback to be honest. So I get that wanting to maybe hold back from repotting, but I thought I'd just talk about what's going to happen with the tree when you don't repot, when it should be repotted. And then I thought, for the latter section, what to do when you have decided, because you may still at the end of this podcast go, you know what, I'm definitely going to be leaving that tree. I'm not going to have a crack at it. I'm going to leave it alone. But then you might find in 3 months, 6 months, maybe it's summer, something like that, maybe it's autumn, you start seeing issues with the tree and you think, how do I get around this now for the next period until it's repotting time? So I'll go through that again with you as well. But mainly I want to talk about if you do decide not to, then there's some negative impacts that's going to happen on the tree, and I'll explain what they are throughout the podcast. So you've got your bonsai. You've looked at the last repot tag that says, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5, whatever it is. You look at it and go, one more year. One more year will be okay. It'll be all right. You've made your decision. Everything's cool. The tree looks great. Tree looks fine. You can probably do with a bit of a slowdown year to maintain things. But what happens to a tree that suddenly gets too long in the pot? It fills the pot with roots. So we start out we use these nice open mixes now, pumice-based mix, whatever it is that you're using, pumice and scoria for me mainly, that really provides this nice open area. The tree roots get lots of oxygen, soil air, and they can breathe. They're happy and healthy. The water passes through rapidly. The tree roots grow at a really fast rate of knots, and it's happy days. Everything's great. Everything's working really well. But eventually what happens is year on year is the roots fill all those areas where they were gathering lots of water and nutrients from fertilizing. That suddenly starts to run out, and the roots then hit the edge of the pot and they start wrapping around. They start circling around the outside of the pot, and everything starts to get denser and denser and denser. And ultimately, that little brick starts to form, that solid, massive roots where there is no room for anything. So what happens is the tree runs out of room in a pot. This is where it's different to a tree in the ground, obviously, and which is why we have repotting cycles. Trees in the ground can just keep extending and finding new spaces basically forever, pretty much, till they see their days out. But for us in a pot, when the tree runs out of room, it starts to not develop the fine feeder roots. Those fine feeder roots are the be-all and end-all. That's what makes strong bonsai. That's where the uptake of water and nutrients happens. So when they can't happen anymore, when the tree stops making as many or any of those newer roots, then the tree starts to go into a decline, which is where by not repotting a more mature tree that you want finer growth on, what happens above happens below. So if the roots have got a really fine, limited amount of growth, then of course above the tree, in balance with the root system, will have a finer, more delicate growth as well. But if those roots start to decline for whatever reason, because there is no oxygen, they can't survive in that area, then the foliage above will start to be sacrificed as a result to try and balance the tree, bring it back into harmony between the engine, the root system of the tree, and the foliage mass. You also find that you can get roots cutting into each other when they get too tight and that sort of stuff. But anyway, and what happens with that compression or expansion of the root system, but the compression of those particles, they start to break down and it starts to get crushed. So where you had a beautiful piece of pumice that was nice and open on scoria that were really open, holding that structure apart and allowing those roots to grow so well, 5 years later, it's dust. Everything's been crushed inside that pot. And so that ability for soil air to exist in there starts to disappear. So you may as well be using a completely organic fine mix, because it's the same issue. That compaction of the soil that's broken down makes it so hard for water to get out. It retains water so much in those areas, and it makes it really hard for that soil air to reach those roots. So you'll find that when we talked a few weeks ago, you might remember we talked about root rot and how when the roots stay too wet and don't get that ability to dry out quite as much, that we start getting dieback in areas of the tree's root system. Now, that can happen in a beautiful mix 1 year, 5 years later, or however long later, once it's compacted down, that can happen again. So you might be using a beautiful mix, but it's the routine, that regularity of enabling those roots to continue to grow in new medium that really keeps the tree at peak condition. So that as the soil breaks down and it starts to compress, you're going to start getting those issues start to appear. So, like I said, it's the holding of the water, the lack of the ability for the roots to be able to breathe, that really starts to have a massive impact on the tree. And if you think about it, when you fertilize the tree, the nutrients that we offer to the tree can only get taken up by the root system. Now, if that root system starts to fail, doesn't matter how many bags of fertilizer you're putting on there. And this is the same story I tell over and over when it comes to the soil mix that we use. But it's the same. You're in the same boat after too many years of not repotting as what you are for using a rubbish soil mix. So fertilizing becomes a bit of a waste of time because the tree just can't take it up. It's not that you're not doing the right thing. You're putting the fertilizer out there for the tree. You're offering it to the tree. And whether it's a liquid feed or it's a tea bag or whatever system it is that you're using, you might be dunking the root system into a bath of fertilizer. Fantastic. But if the roots can't take it up, if there's not those new fine feeder roots available to take it up, then what's the point? It starts to become a futile exercise if the tree can't actually get what it needs from its root system. And as I say, what happens above happens below. What happens below happens above. It's a balancing scenario. So if that root system starts to struggle and fail, then you're going to get an issue when it comes to the foliage or the structure of the tree. I'll give you an example. There was a cedar that was shown to me. Someone had purchased and they said, "How lovely, look at these beautiful small needles." And this is a common thing. You might be nodding your head as you listen to this. Beautiful small needles. Suddenly you repot it and all of a sudden those needles get out to a longer size. You go, hang on a minute, I wanted the small fine needles. They look beautiful. But if you'd done an analysis of the health of the tree back before repotting it, the new buds that were there and possible dieback that happens every year on year for that tree just to maintain its alive ratio is incredible. And the repotting reinvigorates the tree, so therefore the needles of the cedar go back to exactly where they should be, exactly what the genetics of this tree dictate, say the size of the needle should be. So you might find that you're chasing smaller leaves. So not repotting a tree for 100 years might give you smaller leaves, but also gives you a tree on the brink of death that can't actually grow anymore, or that grows a little bit but dies somewhere else. The whole structure of the tree starts to collapse when the root system is in decline. I used to get told a long time ago with radiata pines, for instance, the only way you can get small needles is to not repot them too frequently, hold back the water and hold back the fertilizer. And yeah, sure, that is because it puts the tree on the brink of death. So it only has a limited amount of resources, which means it can only grow a needle mass to a certain size because it physically doesn't have anything else left in the tank. And that's probably the complete opposite way of me thinking about how trees in pots should be looked after. Our bonsai should be lush, should be super healthy. We should be deciding with our scissors as to where resources get allocated, rather than tree going, you know what, that's got to die because I just can't support it. I'm sorry, but that lovely part of the tree that looks the best, it's got to go. Another thing you'll find is that the trees will suddenly become more prone to pest and disease. So if you've got a tree that's slightly weak, that you're thinking about not repotting now, and you've had some pest issues with it in the past, I'd guarantee you that is probably the worst thing you can do, because you'll invite more and more of those issues to ramp up, and suddenly they'll take a bigger chunk of the tree's strength away from it, because the tree just cannot defend itself. As a weakened tree, a poorly maintained root system that just cannot do its job, means that the tree's defense system is going to be weaker. So therefore, you're going to be in a position where you've got a tree that's more susceptible to fungal issues, and you might say, and this is a true story. Someone came and told me that aphids killed their tree, right? And I fail to see how an aphid, in my experience, could kill a bonsai, a strong tree that should live forever. It's not. It's the tipping point. So what caused it is more than likely that repotting wasn't done correctly, or like I talked about last week on the tying in sort of thing, or if it's been not repotted frequently enough, so therefore the root system can't do its job, so therefore the uptake of absolutely everything that it needs stops or comes to a bare minimum, and the tree gets to a point where it just doesn't have enough in the tank to continue to fight, and then something as small as a little aphid comes along and there's an infestation, suddenly the tree starts to kick over. You start to lose the ability to manage your tree's growth, because pruning becomes sort of non-existent. I've seen it with a lot of maples, a lot of deciduous that possibly haven't been repotted when they should have, that instead of pushing out that central bud that continues to grow and continues to extend, they open up, get a set of leaves, and then that's it. They stop because there's just not enough resources for the tree to continue allocating to new growth. So it'll do what it has to do to photosynthesize, to produce the sugars that it needs to survive, but that's it. There's no more extension. So if you've got a plan for your tree to get this beautiful, fine, delicate growth all over it, and that's why I'm going to hold back repotting on the tree this year, or maybe for the next 2 years, or whatever it is, then you run the risk of not taking a step forward, but taking about 3 or 4 serious steps backwards. Significant branch loss, structure loss on the tree, possibly even, without being overly dramatic, possibly even death of the tree. So I think that you've really got to have a really good reason that if one side of you is saying tree needs to be repotted, it's been the period of time, the roots are really compacted, there feels like there's no give in there, I have to do something about it. But then the other side of you says, well, imagine that with another year's growth on it. Imagine that fine, beautiful, delicate growth, how good that would look. I've had this argument with myself. I have it every year. I continue to have it every year, because that when it works, that 1 year of fine, delicate growth is magnificent. It's beautiful, especially on a deciduous. For me, it gets you into the really pointy end of a lovely, well-refined tree. But I've also been on exactly the same battle with myself, saying, now look what you've done, you idiot, because you left it go, And now we've got dieback, we've got struggle. Summer's coming just around the corner. What the hell are you going to do about it? And how are we going to get this tree to the point that it's going to survive, not thrive, but just survive throughout this really extreme period before we can actually repot it? And they're talking about the summer that we're going to get this year is going to be a stinker. I've been looking at what's been happening through Europe, and there's extreme heat waves coming. So our winter, maybe it's been reasonably mild in Melbourne, but the summer that they're warning we're going to have is going to be extreme. Now, you really want a bonsai that's going to be in absolutely perfect condition for that sort of extended period that it's going to have to face. We can shelter, we can do whatever, but there's still some are going to slip through the net. So this is where I'd strongly encourage you, if there's that doubt in your mind, take on board these points about what's going to physically happen with the tree and what impact it's going to have, so you can at least be aware of it. If you do let's say you do decide not to repot and you do start to see some of these issues, then listen up to the next section of the podcast, because I'd let you know what my plans would be to get the tree through to that next phase. Okay, so you decide not to repot, that's fine. You suddenly get a few months down the track and you say, probably not the best decision. Probably should have repotted that tree when I had time. Hence the reason for the timing of this podcast, because you still got time. But you do decide that it's a bad decision. You can see some impact with that spring growth. You know that literally summer is just around the corner. Warm temperatures, the news media channels start banging on about what we're going to be facing, whether it's true or whether it's not. They'll be pushing it because maybe a slow news day, so they focus on extreme weather events. But you've got to make some action. You've got to do something with that tree. You can't just leave it. Just putting your head in the sand when the tree is in that predicament can be disastrous. And I'm not underplaying it. Going into summer with any tree, even a mild summer, going into summer with any tree that doesn't have the ability to push moisture up through its root system and out through the foliage is going to lead to damage. Whether it's just, cross your fingers, hopefully it's only damage to the leaf itself, like you might get some leaf burn. But, you work your way back from that. What's holding the leaf? Those fine branches. All right, so they're stuffed. They start getting damaged. What's beyond that? All right, it's the secondary branches. All right, so they start to struggle. Then it leads to the primary branches. You may even get it to the point where if there's not enough fluid flowing through the trunk of the tree, you may find that lack of water and maybe exposure to extreme heat events can lead to dieback on the trunk itself. I'm sure everyone's seen trees or may even have them in your collection that have been sunburnt on the bark. And often that comes from the root system, maybe significant root removal when it's come out of the ground, you first dug it up or whatever, it hasn't been protected for long enough to build up the root structure that it needs before it's been exposed to the elements, leads to that burning of the trunk, which once that bark, once that cambium is burnt, it's sort of downhill for that part of the trunk, and you'll find that there'll be ultimately, maybe not straight away, but ultimately there'll be a dieback on the trunk, and you'll find that there'll just be exposed deadwood. Sure, you can build it into the structure of the tree. You can try and heal it as best you possibly can over the next decade or so. But the best way to avoid it, obviously, is to focus on the root system before that exposure. So we'll just come back to a few simple points that I covered off in the first section. Was the substrate's going to break down, right? So it's going to turn into a dust environment where there's no ability for water to penetrate that root system. And if there's no availability of space for new roots to grow, so therefore the tree not only isn't getting enough water into that intersection of the root mass, but there's nowhere for new roots to grow either. So we've got to look at opening up that root ball without repotting the tree. the tree's already partway through the growing season. It's out of dormancy. You're midway through spring. Let's say it's a couple of months after spring started when you start to see these issues, and that's really for me when you are going to see it. If spring starts in September, it'll be maybe around about October-ish, late October. You'll start to look at it and go, it just doesn't look the same as the other varieties, or it should be better than that. It should be healthier, and I'm pumping fertilizer into it, but it just doesn't seem to be doing anything. Like the trees, sort of treading water, doing nothing. It's just holding still in a space, and it's not growing, but it's surviving just. So that's where you need to look at a couple of things. First thing I'd do would be to look at raking off the top layer of soil. And I've talked about this before, called soji, right? So it's where you're doing, imagine it being like a partial in-pot repot. And I'll just run through the brief scenario so you've got it in your kit bag. So if it does happen to you, you can take action. Use something like a root rake or a chopstick and just take off the top layer of soil, whatever it is. Get rid of that first. Scratch it out, tip the pot over and shake it out. Work your way down the edges of the pot too. So from an angle from the nabari of the tree down towards the edge of the pot, maybe take out up to probably half the depth of the pot on an angle sloping down, where you'll use your root pruning scissors and you'll cut out that root system. So you're taking out possibly not a quarter of the roots, probably just under a quarter of the root system will be removed by doing that, right? So you've taken that down. And then what you need to do is you need to start looking at aerating the soil. And that can be, depending on how packed it is, it may need to be a drill bit with, say, a 5 or 6 millimeter drill in there to actually get through that root system. If you try and use a simple disposable chopstick, you might find you can jam it in there, and as soon as you go to wiggle it, it's going to snap. You might use a plastic chopstick, get it in there, but when you wiggle it, it doesn't actually do anything at all. There's beautiful things like the metal chopsticks that you can get with a sharp end that I was given by a mate that works fantastic for this sort of thing. But if it's so jam-packed in that pot, using a drill bit to go around, and every 3 to 5 centimetres, depending on the size of the pot, of course. The bigger the pot, sort of the further apart they can be. The smaller, you might want to put them a little bit closer. Just start drilling holes through the root system. Now, that's going to break it up a little bit more and allow for that water to get in there, but also for the oxygen to get in there and allow the water to evaporate out the pot as well. Once you've done that drilling, so you've removed the edge of the root system, you've drilled in, you've aerated that mix as well, then get your root rake, the smaller style root rake, and just try and break up that surface a little bit more. Try and make it a little bit fluffier. All right. So yeah, you're sure. I get that you will damage roots when you do this, but we need to do something. And you need to do it fast, because the growing period of spring is coming to an end when the tree can start pushing out those new roots. I'm not worried in the slightest about getting any more new foliage between this period and when summer gets here. What I'm worried about and what I want to generate is a viable root system that can take up the water, that can allow the tree to transpire, to ensure that in a protected environment, the tree can get through this summer period. The long, hot summer they're talking about that's coming, even if it's not long and hot, even if it's just summer in general, then you want the tree to be able to get through that other side and to be able to take up some fertilizer before it heads into the semi-dormant period of summer. But especially when autumn comes around next year, I want to be able to fertilise that tree well and make sure that it can actually do something with it. And it needs those new roots to be able to do that. So I'd scratch once I've drilled the holes, I'd get in there and I'd scratch up that root system. Sure, remove all the broken roots that are in there as well, and just make sure that it's feeling a little bit softer. So physically push on that root system. If it still feels like a concrete brick, you might need to just do a little bit more of that chopstick in there and wiggling, just to break things up a little bit more. So once you've got all that done, get some new soil mix, really nice soil mix. As you would normally, fill it up to the side, chopstick it in a little bit. You're not trying to work it into the roots because there's no roots there to go work it into. It's more to break it and flatten it down. So just don't overdo it. Once or twice around the pot with a chopstick, should settle it down pretty much. Give it a good pat down with your hand so it flattens down those particles. And just a tip as well to try and get some more water into that inner dried section of the root ball. The new soil you put in there, put it just below the lip of the pot. Don't put it to the lip of the pot where the water can just sort of hit it and run off. Have it so that new soil is just below the lip of the pot, so it creates a bit of a slight pooling scenario for the tree. What you can do too is to sort of help at the bottom for the drainage is again use your drill coming up underneath the pot before you put the new soil in, and just punch a couple of extra holes. Don't go too hard, maybe depending on where the nabari of the tree is going to be sitting, the solid part, maybe only go up a couple of centimetres or something like that, just to give the tree some availability to pool the water and then drop out through those drainage holes. But yeah, so you put in the new soil just below the lip of the pot. Get your grated sphagnum moss, nice and fine. Put a nice layer on the tree. Water it in, pat down the sphagnum moss so it's going to stick to the pot, and then get onto a regime of constant sea salt. The seaweed tonic that the trees need. Get onto liquid feeding. Get onto putting tea bags on the tree. Whatever it is that you need to do, just really start to give this tree a real boost, and make sure that, so the last 4 weeks because that's normally when I see it happening a lot, that last 4 weeks of summer before we get into last 4 weeks of spring before you get into the summer period, make sure that your fertilising and watering is absolutely tip-top, that it's spot on, that it's exactly right, that the tree's getting exactly what it needs. Put it into a partially shaded spot as well, so it's protected for a little while, but not too long. Like, I'm talking maybe a couple of weeks, just to let those new roots start to really start to form. Then get it back out into the open, get sunlight there, get the tree really starting to push the demands of its root system, so it can start pushing those new roots into the new soil that you put in there. And that should in theory give you a really good start for where the tree is going to need to head to. By no stretch of the imagination is the tree out of the woods, and there's definitely some compassion that's going to be needed to be shown to that tree throughout the summer period. So you might have done the first bit, protect it for a couple of weeks, build its strength up, put it back out in the open, really start fertilising, feeding, getting it up to strength, and then as those hotter days start to kick in, be aware that the tree's vulnerable, that it's not quite where it should be. So then you slip it into a slightly sheltered spot again for the entire summer period, just to help it get through. You're providing support system for it to get through until autumn. Then you can start, as the weather starts to cool down again, slides back out into a more open environment. Fertilising happens like crazy. You really start to build it up. And then you put it on, you do two more things. You put it on the list to get repotted the year after, and you give yourself a smack across the wrist for not having done it when you should have. Because really, the decision to repot or not to repot falls on your shoulders. And right now, you've still got an opportunity to repot those trees. So it might mean a later night, might mean organising some more mix. It might be buying another pot, whatever it is. The downside of not doing it, you should understand, is significant and potentially disastrous for the tree. So by making the decision to repot now, you've still got time to get yourself out of jail. You've still got time for that tree to continue to take steps forward and flourish. And ask yourself the question, is a year of fine, delicate growth, does that supersede the fact that the tree could take a massive step backwards and you could lose half the foliage on the tree? Again, this is experience talking here, and I still make the same mistake, so I get it. But really, I'm pushing you now to say, just have a good hard think about it, because you've got time. Where would you be if you didn't have me sitting here telling you all these stories about how I've stuffed up my bonsai and what you can do to get yourself out of jail and save your trees going into another summer around the corner? No, but seriously, I love the fact that experience, if you take it on board when someone passes on their hard learned wisdom or knowledge, if you can take that on board, it can shortcut the failure rate or the heartache that's going to cause you, and the potential damage it's going to cause to your tree. And you think about the length of time to repot a tree. Let's call it on a good day. Let's say it's an hour. All right, an hour to repot that tree, and you're doing it every 2 to 3 years. That's not much of an investment. It's not much. And a couple of bucks for soil, a few cents for wire and mesh, really, and the effort that it takes, it's not much. It's really not much. And if it is too much, then maybe you just need to have a look at the number of trees that are in the collection, because you've probably got way too many. If you're knocking back repotting a tree because you've got too many, then that's a whole nother story. If you're not repotting because the tree's too heavy, then that again is another scenario that you need to encounter, and possibly think about making a phone call to a bonsai buddy to say, hey, can you give me a hand with this one? Because, like I've said, it's pretty clear what happens to the trees when they're not looked after the way they should be, and I'd hate for that to happen to anyone that listens to the podcast. Thanks for listening in. Thank you to the subscribers. You are brilliant. You really are. And if you feel like you'd like to support the podcast, then please do. In the show notes, there's a link to become a subscriber. Completely optional, and I do appreciate it that things are tough. So thank you for those that. It means a lot, those that do support the podcast and support me with what I do. So thanks for listening in. Give those trees a cuddle and make the decision to repot. If in doubt, repot. If it's been more than 1 year, if you're in the 2 year plus cycle and you're in doubt, if there's that grey area, then take my advice and repot the tree. See you next week. Until next time, happy bonsai.